Although style has always been an important part of the automobile, we sometimes forget the importance of the styling of the part we view the most, the part directly in front of us, the interior, or more specifically, the dashboard. Originally, a dashboard had nothing to do with instrumentation. It was simply a deflector to protect the driver from what might be kicked up by something such as a dashing horse. But once the horse was removed, the dashboard remained, and the only thing attached to it would have been supports for the steering tiller, and perhaps some wood or leather trim, presuming it was made from something other than wood and leather. Throttle controls were either on the tiller shaft, or starting in 1900, on the floor, while brake and transmission controls were often on the side of the vehicle. The steering wheel would be introduced in the mid-1890s, and would become commonplace within a decade, while other things were starting to find their way to the dashboard, such as spark advance controls on the coil, or some kind of storage such as a leather satchel, woven basket, or wooden box, precursors to the glove box. There could be an ignition lock, and a bulb horn could be mounted either inside or outside of the vehicle. Steam-powered cars were the earliest to use gauges, typically a pressure gauge, mounted in a variety of locations. But with the growing popularity of the front engine, the dashboard became the firewall, a different sort of protective barrier that also originated with the steam-powered vehicles. But on the inside of the cab, it was still referred to as the dashboard. Instrumentation started to appear on them shortly thereafter, but most of it was aftermarket. Gauges from the factory were pretty much a luxury item, and might include a speedometer, oil temperature gauge, amp meter, or clock. By 1910, the speedometer had become fairly common, but was by no means standard across the board. And with the move to torpedo bodies, doors would become more common, and the cowl had started to make an appearance, essentially a hood or top to the dashboard. This helped shelter electronics mounted inside of the firewall, and created a place closer to the driver to mount controls, on what some would call an instrument board. But the rest of the industry still called it a dashboard. It contained such things as controls for the electric lights that would start to make an appearance, inside and out, along with electric start, which could be on the dash, but was often just a floor-mounted button. The rearview mirror made an appearance on the Marmon Wasp at the 1911 Indy 500. Over the next decade, water temperature gauges would move from the radiator cap to the dash, and fuel gauges from the filler cap to the dash, on those few that had them. Studebaker being the first in 1914, made possible by a cowl-mounted fuel tank. But after the electric fuel gauge was first used by Rickenbacker in 1925, they then became increasingly more common. By the mid-20s, a factory central gauge cluster, or instrument panel, became the norm. The odometer had become common, and controls would start to become standardized. A layout first used by Cadillac in 1916, but was popularized by the Austin 7 introduced in 1922. The same year, windshield wipers would become a standard feature on Cadillacs. The fully enclosed cabin was gaining popularity as they became increasingly more affordable, but one could also opt for a dual cowl phaeton, or a town car, with a separate windshield and dashboard for the rear passengers, which could include glove boxes for each side, and possibly even a clock or a minibar. Although the difference in instrumentation between entry-level cars and high-end cars was quite apparent, meaning aftermarket gauges were still common on cheaper cars, often being mounted next to a manual choke. And the speedometer would start to replace the clock as the prominent gauge, as speed limits on open roads were starting to be enforced. With GM's lead, style was increasingly becoming a selling point, with higher-end cars moving away from the functional cockpit design to a rolling living room with couch-like seating. The dashboard was more likely to be metal than wood by this point, and gauge clusters would start to gain an Art Deco look, with geometric shapes, and often be surrounded by brightwork, such as polished nickel or machined aluminum, a trend that would carry well into the 1930s. The car heater was first offered as an option by Ford in 1929, followed by GM the next year, with fairly modern heat and ventilation systems appearing before the end of the 1930s. Some brands were painting steel dashboards to look like wood, while other brands were still using real wood for instrument clusters. Various types of semi-automatic transmissions were finding their way to market, ranging from those that only required the clutch to stop and start to the pre-selector type, and the shifter would start to move to the column to make better use of those big bench seats, with the floor shifter being reserved for cars intended for more aggressive driving. The tachometer predates the car, having been used on locomotives, and was actually slow to see use in cars, but was starting to appear in track-oriented models. Manual spark controls were beginning to disappear, while interior safety was starting to become a thing, with more rounded and recessed switches and edges that were less likely to impale or gash the delicate flesh that may come in contact with them. By the late 30s, the center cluster was falling from favor, with primary instruments being shifted to directly in front of the driver, something that entry-level brands were more likely to adopt than premium brands were. But the center section would see the introduction of the AM car radio. Although portable radios had started appearing in cars in the 1920s, Motorola introduced the first real car radio in 1930, and a grill to house the single speaker became the dominant styling component. Packard would introduce power windows in 1940, and GM would introduce the fully automatic transmission shortly thereafter, and soon the turn signal would become a standard feature on many models. Primary gauges would start to move to the larger dial type. After the war, Tucker would create another push towards safety that included the padded dash, which Chrysler would call a safety cushion in 1949, when they also introduced key ignition. With the move to one-piece windshields, some rear-view mirrors were relocated to the top of the dash. Style would be a big part of instrumentation by this time, in some cases more so than functionality, with chrome playing a bigger role as interior trim, and power seats would start to make an appearance. Although by 1950, driver-focused instrumentation was pretty much the standard, and the center speaker grille would incorporate the surrounding controls. Pontiac claimed to have the most beautiful dash, and had a clock in the center of the speaker. The shape of the dashboard itself would also start to become less symmetrical, gaining a larger console for the gauges and controls in front of the driver. Cigarette lighters and ashtrays had first started appearing in luxury cars in the mid-20s, but by the mid-50s they would become standard in most American cars, along with heaters, about when seatbelts had become an option. Luxury cars would start to offer climate control and air conditioning, and the speaker would start to transition to the top of the dash. The push-button automatic appeared on numerous cars in the late 50s and early 60s, starting with Chrysler products in 1954, becoming an early steering wheel control in the 58 Edsel. And by this time, Benz were taking control of the American market. Instrument clusters were becoming equally extravagant, and in some cases, with fins of their own, with big arcing speedometers evolving into fully horizontal ones by decade's end, and power windows and door locks becoming increasingly popular luxury options. Cadillac would utilize the glove box door as a serving tray, a feature that would spread quickly. These are sometimes referred to as the first cup holders, but they were not intended for use while the vehicle was in motion. Chrysler would introduce cruise control in the 1958 Imperial, although it was Cadillac that named it cruise control the following year, when the swivel seat appeared as an option in Chrysler's full line of cars, to be followed shortly thereafter by electroluminescent lighting. The 1961 Thunderbird introduced the swing-away steering column and the floating rearview mirror, which is to say, glued to the windshield, and the center console would start to gain popularity, with the Fossil Vega being one of the earliest examples. It was also about this time that the automatic on the floor started to make an appearance in four-seaters, ranging from Oldsmobile to Mercedes-Benz, but it had first appeared in the 53 Corvette. 1963 would see the start of the rather quick transition to transistor radios, while imports tended to be more utilitarian up to this point. But that isn't to say they were without style, and as would be expected for the price of a premium import, there were certain levels of posh. The push-button automatic would be regulated out of existence in 1965, but tachometers were starting to be an expectation for performance cars. Automobile record players had become a thing starting with Chrysler in 1956, and would carry well into the 1960s, but they were problematic for a number of reasons. So soon a real alternative to the radio arrived at Ford in 1965 with the 8-track player, with full albums being available at the local auto parts store. Tilt steering was offered by most premium brands by the mid-60s, followed soon after by the addition of a telescopic function, and seat belts would be required starting in 1966. But utilitarian would be the direction things would be moving, partially in the name of crash safety. Aluminum had also become a popular detail element, particularly on sportier models, and heaters had become a standard feature in most import cars. And although underseat heaters appeared in the 1930s, Saab would introduce modern heated seats and mirrors in 1969, when the locking steering column became the standard, although it too had been around since at least the 1930s. Around 1970, remaining metal surfaces started to disappear, usually covered by padded vinyl, with an increase in plastic interior trim overall, often in a dark color, and wood veneer trim would start to be replaced by fake plastiwood or even contact paper. Philips made the first car cassette player in 1968, creating a rival to the 8-track player, with the first factory cassette players appearing in the early 70s, along with FM radio, and by this point, they could be played in full stereo sound, while air conditioning was offered as a standard feature on premium cars and AMC Ambassadors. But the overall look would be clean and simple, usually with a squared-off instrument cluster. And while higher-end cars would offer what they referred to as full instrumentation, entry-level cars would be making greater use of the cheaper but less informative warning light. Starting in the early 70s, velour seats would become a popular option on high-end vehicles, even more so than leather, soon to be followed by pillow seats. Fake wood trim would become increasingly popular, even appearing in cheaper cars, and designer interiors would be at their peak, particularly at AMC and Lincoln. Factory Citizen band radios would appear for a short period, following that fad, primarily in high-end luxury cars, which may have missed their target demographic a bit. Dimmer switches were being transitioned to the column from the floor, where they had been since the late 1920s, and square gauges were becoming the next trend. By 1980, things were becoming even more plasticky. Voice alerts first appeared in the 1981 Nissan Maxima, an 80s trend that mostly stayed there. Bose and GM teamed up to create premium car audio systems starting in 1982, a trend that really took off. By this time, 8-tracks were gone, and column shifters and bench seats were falling from favor, with the center console and driver's cockpit quickly becoming the preferred look, while teeny buttons and small knobs were considered futuristic, and manual transmissions would become limited to mostly budget and performance cars. Digital instrumentation first appeared in the 1976 Aston Martin Lagonda, but it was all the rage by the mid-80s. Pioneer introduced the car CD player in 1984, but it wasn't until the Lincoln Town Car of 1987 you could get one from the factory. Car phones had become a thing during World War II, and although they would never be a popular option, they would peak in the 80s as a symbol of status. Bright, multicolored seat patterns were becoming trendy, particularly on cloth seats, while fake wood was being replaced by plain black and gray plastic on more mainstream cars. Volkswagen started offering automatic seat belts in the mid-70s, but starting in 1987, regulations required them in all cars without airbags, while the analog gauge would start to be viewed as a classic sporty look. In the late 80s, they started lining the outer edge of the instrument cluster with various buttons, and after more than 40 years of experimentation, heads-up display finally transitioned from aircraft to automobiles, starting with the 1988 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme pace car. In the 80s, clocks had gone digital and become integrated into the stereo system, but in the early 90s, analog clocks would make a comeback in luxury cars. Traditional dial gauges would also be making a comeback, having proven to be cheaper, more reliable, and easier to read. Center consoles were becoming fully integrated into the dash by the early 90s, no longer seeming to be a separate entity, or appearing to be an add-on. In 1995, mandatory driver's airbags put an end to the automatic seatbelt, and created limitations on using tilt and telescopic steering, as well as child seating, due to safety concerns. While the cigarette lighter and ashtray would be transitioning to the power port and coin cubby. And although real factory cup holders first appeared in the Chrysler minivans of 1983, they were an expected part of an interior car design by the mid-90s. Navigation systems would start appearing in regular production cars, followed shortly thereafter by other remote services provided by satellite communications, with GM's OnStar being perhaps the best known. Interior colors were starting to become more neutral, mostly grays and tans. In-dash MP3 players started to appear in 1999, although high costs kept them limited to start with, as was the true adaptive cruise control introduced in the S-Class Mercedes that year. Starting with the 2000 Cadillac DeVille, night vision became available on some cars, and the Chrysler 300 would be the first to offer Bluetooth. The 1986 Buick Riviera was the first car with a center touchscreen, but the infotainment system touchscreen started appearing in cars in the early 2000s. Experimentation with backup cameras began in the mid-50s, with the first being used in Japan in 1991, and taking another decade to make it to the US. Push-button start would make a comeback with the move to keyless ignition, and in 2002, Lincoln would give us adjustable pedals, and Cadillac, satellite radio. USB ports would begin to appear in cars in the mid-2000s, but aluminum-colored plastic was becoming more common. 2008 would see mandatory tire pressure warning systems, first seen on the Porsche 959 in 1986, deemed necessary after the whole Firestone Ford Explorer rollover fiasco of the 90s. 2010 would be the last year of factory cassette players, as hard as that is to believe, and although Mitsubishi introduced a lane departure warning system in 1992, autocorrect functionality wasn't appearing until around 2013. Digital gauges were making a comeback, and would take a huge leap forward with the 2014 Audi Virtual Cockpit, with a customizable CGI instrument panel. Around this same time, the rotary shift dial made an appearance from brands such as Jaguar and Chrysler, and the push-button automatic had made a return from brands ranging from Honda to Lincoln. There was an introduction of mobile apps to sync a phone to your car, such as Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and by 2018, several luxury cars offered side-view cameras in place of mirrors, while backup cameras became mandatory. Starting in 2020, the center touchscreen had begun to take on all secondary controls, a trend more common on luxury models, at a time when distracted driving has become the biggest safety issue. USB-C ports are the latest trend, while the CD player may very well be at its end. Although if self-driving cars are in fact the future, you might want to keep those entertainment options open. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.